In my early days of listening to music, I, I started out with what would you call it, rock, metal, more of the alternative scene, indie, mostly just, I would reckon, rock, metal, and EDM, and pop, of course. Basically, any like hard hitting sound that you could really get into. I was probably into that early on. So, you would have some pop acts, of course, because you can't really avoid those, EDM. And, rock and metal I discovered later when I was in my teens. But I didn't really get into hip hop for the most part. I just kind of glanced over it and I was like, I don't mind it, but I don't really remember how I got into rap. It's not that I'm opposed to the genre, but I've just listened to different kinds of music and rap, of course. Now I'm into it. Hence why this review for Death Grips. And I decided to do Death Grips first because there are some other rap acts that I would get into, but on this channel. But Death Grips is kind of the seminal band that most people would say is or were the seminal or like the most ambitious act of the last decade. And I'm not sure if I agree with that because I was not a huge fan of them early on, and some of the later albums I'm kind of like, you know, I like moments of these, and then songs of this one, and I can kind of take or leave this album. It's mainly that I quite enjoy the early stuff from Death Grips. And I think that is a shared or a common opinion to like the early stuff and then, kind of wander off with the later releases. Not that they're bad or anything, but they just grab my attention less. But, from experience, I do like the bands. I think I needed like a whole year to get into the whole, like, not necessarily abstract or industrial hip hop. I don't really mind that sound. I do quite like industrial personally, and hip hop as well. So combine them, I think it's pretty cool. But Death Grips was a difficult one for me because I just really did not understand MC Wright's screaming. I did not understand why he was yelling over like every instrumental. I didn't really get that. But over time, I did enjoy it and I did get into that groove because, if you have that instrumental or that beat that Death Grips has, then you really need to kind of yell over that because the music is so, you know, just noisy and kind of chaotic. So if you don't scream over that, you will just get buried in the mix. I think that is kind of that's the most logical explanation for Def Grips' rapping style. That scream rapping that he does. It was kind of difficult for me to get into that, and even now, there are moments where I enjoy that. Other moments where I'm kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm into that right now, but it is a very, let's say, acquired taste. I really needed some time with this band, but I always really liked them instrumentally. I always thought that the production and just how tight everything was, I thought it was pretty great on the Money Store. And, other records like that, like Jenny Deaf and Gentleman on the Moon, let's say. Those are mainly my favorite ones, and Ex Military. That's their first mixtape, which I would still argue is their best release. You know, I just really like the kind of raw and just more eccentric sound of that record. It's kind of sometimes has a jungle beat to it, if that makes sense, or it sounds like you're wandering through the forest. It's kind of like a strange eclectic sound, but it's also very chaotic in that classic Death Grips style. And I actually, I did quite like that album, so I would say that's probably my favorite one. With later releases, it's pretty, you know, you have to try to get into the money store. That's the easiest one. If you can't get into that, then, everything else will be like 10 times worse for you. So don't bother if you don't like the money store. Just keep listening to that one to get into the groove. And then, the band also kind of released the album after that, No Love Deep Web, which is essentially kind of a fuck you to their label because I believe the drummer Zach Hill, he kind of flashed himself on that album. So the album cover is just his dick. And I'm like, that's definitely a statement because they were about to get dropped or something, and they were like, "Oh no, we're not getting dropped. We're leaving." I'm kind of like, "Oh, that's." I don't really know the whole story of it. I didn't really do the research behind it, but I don't think it's really that significant. But Death Grips was kind of like a fuck you band from the start. So in an essence, they are like the most rock and roll stars in hip hop, if you look at it like that. But it's definitely a statement. But I'm not sure if I would have handled it like that. But that album cover exists, so I do think it's good. It's kind of sounds like B sides of the Money Store, but I do think it's sketchy. I really like the production. I would say that it is probably their best produced album. It sounds pretty like technical and eclectic and electronic. I really like the electronic beats on it. Sounds kind of like fine combed. Or what's the word? I'm not English, so it's not my traditional language, but I try. But yeah, I quite like that. I think after that, Jenny Deaf and you know the Moon album came out, and with the first one, I did enjoy that. But you know, with Jenny Deaf, it became a bit more difficult because it's more in the typical kind of Death Grip style. And I do really have to be in the mood for that album to really put it on because the first album is just a whole side of Bjork samples, together with MC Wright yelling over that. So, you know, probably two of the most divisive singers, rappers out there, I would say. Bjork and MC Wright are kind of like you love them or hate them, both of them. So, I happen to love both, but I will say that you really need a long time to really get into their kind of singing style. It's very strange. It's kind of avant-garde, I would say, but also very melodic. So I do like it, but you just need a lot of time with it, in my opinion. Yeah, and then Jenny Deaf is basically I believe a concept album as well, like a double album abstract industrial concept album. I think it's pretty out there. It's a pretty out there album. I do like it, but it's very moody. It's very in your face, like Death Grips, but it's also very emotional, like with On GP. So there's just a lot going on that album. It's definitely a mood for me. I do have to be into that mood to really put on Jenny Deaf for the whole double album, I would say. I think that the first side is a bit easier to just throw on. Jenny Deaf, you really have to be in that mindset to really, get into that groove. So I think for those reasons, the first mixtape and the debut album, I would say are the most easiest albums to get into. Ex-military and the Money Store, respectively. Then you get into the later stuff, which I've checked out less. I did kind of drop out after Jenny Depp because it was just so much music. I was just like, I think I got my fill, man. Especially with Inanimate Sensation. I first really hated that song, but over time it grew me, and now it might be my favorite Death Grip song. I really like it personally. You have Government Plays, which was a instrumental record, or like instrumental, and parts of it were rapped. That actually came out after No Love Deep Web, and then after that, the double album came out. So after that, I think their second last album came out. You also have like a side, or not a side project, but a smaller, like a more low key release with Fashion Week, which I honestly I haven't really checked it out. That's kind of the only album that I'm not really familiar with, but Glitch Hop and Wonky, according to Rage Music. The cover with the chick on the big chair, that one. Not that familiar with it personally, but yeah, it essentially just has 14 songs with Runway in the title, and then a different letter of the alphabet that spells out Jenny Def When. Oh, yeah. They're kind of hyping up their own double album. That's kind of funny. I never checked that, by the way. That's the first time that I looked at it. So there you go. But it came out in the same year, so fans didn't have to wait a long time. That was a decade ago. Damn. So after that came out Bottomless Pit. So this was one of the records that I just kind of threw on, and I did happen to like it, but it's kind of on the same quality as I would say No Love Deep Web and The Money Store, but it just has less distinct hits. So it's just more of the same, I would say. I don't think there's really anything, special about it. It is good. There are some like more synth punky styles on it, and more like digital hardcore. So I do like that. But besides that, it's pretty much the same. It's just a bit more electronic. So I do like Bottle on the Spit for that. And then the last album that they did was Year of the Snitch, which is my least favorite album from them. In the sense of in the sense of albums that garnered acclaim. If you really have to dissect it, you would have to say Government Plates, but that's more of like an instrumental, kind of like a one-off project. But it is technically a Death Grips album, so that's technically my least favorite. But as far as like the traditional, it's kind of weird to call Death Grips anything traditional, but traditional albums, I would say that Year of the Snitch is my least favorite because I think they were more so approaching still in that Bottomless Pit era, which I did like, but I didn't think that it was really that unique or something, or something that I hadn't heard before. But it was good, and Year of the Snitch was just more of that. And if you really look at the Death Grips discography, they have done a double album, they've done a mixtape, which I think is fantastic personally. They've done an accessible album, they've done an instrumental record, they have done side projects or one-offs that are kind of like weird little projects for them. They've done a fuck you to their own label, with No Love Deep Web, which is more instrumental based, but I do quite like those instrumentals personally. So if you really look at the discography of Death Grips, there isn't really anything missing, I would say. There's not really anything that you're still hoping for, wishing for. I think at least I haven't really heard anything that's I'm still eagerly awaiting for Death Grips. I think they announced their, you know, their dis is that the right word? Dismemberment. I think that's not the right term. They announced their discontinuation. They yeah, they announced their discontinuation. I think earlier this year or last year. I'm not sure, but they were like 15 years going strong. And I personally also couldn't really, name anything that they could still do. They've released one of my favorite mixtapes. They've released a very critically acclaimed debut, like most like rappers would do. And usually when you make a record like that, it usually kind of goes downhill. But they also done a very ambitious double album, like I said already. So I don't really have much to add to this. I do think they have one of the most consistent discographies in rap because in industrial nowadays I would probably listen more to dialect and clipping because they're just a bit easier to reach on the shelf. They're just a bit easier to kind of throw on and enjoy. With Death Grips, I really have to be in that mindset of, oh, I need some aggressive music right now. I really need to like vent out. But I'm not really an angry person. I'm not really frustrated. My life is pretty balanced, I would say. So I don't really need like aggressive music in my life. But sometimes it is fun to just throw on the shit and just kind of go berserk. And Death Grips is, I would say, the most appropriate band for that. So that was the reason that I wanted to cover them today. I knew the discography. I figured I've done a lot of these metal bands already, so I figured might as well switch the genre up for a bit. But yeah, that was you know, my review for Death Grips. If I had to like rank the discography, I would say Ex-Military is number one for me. Then The Morning Star. Then I would say The Gentleman, the Moon album, and then Jenny Death. The powers that be. That would be number three for me. Then I would say Bottomless Pit. Yeah, Bottomless Pit. Then No Love Deep Web, Year of the Snitch, and last place, of course, Government Place, because it's not really that significant. I don't really have a unique Death Grips opinion, but I just wanted to share mine because, I do consider them now one of my favorites, but I did just needed a long time to really get into it, but I did last year, so there you go. That's my review. Yeah, if you want another band reviewed that I happen to listen to, feel free to suggest it in the comments. I'm happy to see it or read it. You can recommend different bands, different rappers, anything that comes to mind. Feel free to leave it in the comments. Always welcoming to hear the discussion. If you have an opinion about, dialect, clipping, anything other industrial hip hop, I like to hear it. I'm also open for recommendations. Probably the one, probably for industrial, I would say industrial hip hop. I first got into JPEG Mafia, so I would say start with that. I can also do discographies for them, but that would probably be later because I've only heard like their most popular releases, so I'll figure that out. But thanks for watching. Do the typical YouTube stuff that the algorithm likes. I would appreciate that. Stay hydrated, be safe, and take care. Peace.